Picture this, January 27, 1945. A German military train carrying 347 soldiers from the retreating Eastern Front enters a tunnel near Wałbrzych in southwestern Poland. The convoy is desperate, fleeing the advancing Soviet Red Army that's crushing Germany's defensive lines and racing toward Berlin. At 0347 hours, the train's engineer radios the next station, announcing expected arrival in 20 minutes. At 0349 hours, Soviet artillery begins shelling the area, targeting the railway line that thousands of German troops are using to retreat westward. At 0352 hours, all communication from the train ceases. Search parties sent after the bombardment ends find the tunnel's western entrance collapsed, tons of rock and debris blocking the passage. The eastern entrance shows no sign that a train ever entered. For 78 years, 347 men and their locomotive will remain exactly where they stopped, buried beneath Polish soil that's been transformed by war, occupation, communism's rise and fall, and eventually European integration. Until 2023, when ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted for a planned railway modernization project detect something impossible. The tunnel wasn't collapsed, it was sealed, deliberately, from both ends, and what waits inside, preserved by conditions that shouldn't exist in an abandoned railway passage, will prove that the train carried more than soldiers. It carried secrets that 3 governments spent 78 years trying to keep buried. The train designated Sonderzug 517, Special Train 517, had departed from a staging area near Krakow on the evening of January 26, 1945, carrying Wehrmacht soldiers, SS personnel, and what manifests vaguely described as sensitive materials requiring immediate relocation. The soldiers aboard were a mix of combat veterans pulled from collapsing fronts and specialists whose skills the Reich needed to preserve as the war entered its final desperate phase. Among them was Hauptmann Werner Steiner, a logistics officer who kept a meticulous journal documenting the chaos of Germany's retreat. Steiner's journal, recovered from his family's possession in Munich in 1987 and donated to military archives, contained entries that historians had dismissed as the confused observations of a man under extreme stress. But in light of the 2023 discovery, those entries would be re-examined with growing alarm. January 26, 1945, his final entry before boarding Sonderzug 517, contained observations that suggested something unusual about the train's cargo. "We've loaded 12 sealed freight cars tonight. I was denied access to their contents, told only that they contain materials vital to Project Kronos and must reach Berlin at all costs." The SS guards supervising the loading were from Abteilung Z, a unit I've never encountered despite 4 years of logistics work. They handled the crates with extreme care, wearing protective equipment I don't recognize. One crate fell during loading, cracking its seal. The guards immediately evacuated the platform, and specialists in hazmat suits secured the crate before allowing us to return. Whatever we're transporting, it's not conventional weapons or military supplies. And the way the SS men look at those cars, with fear barely concealed behind military discipline, tells me this cargo is something that frightens even them. The 347 soldiers aboard Sonderzug 517 represented a cross-section of the Wehrmacht in its death throes. Combat infantry who'd survived the Eastern Front's hell. Engineers whose expertise was needed to maintain Germany's crumbling infrastructure. Medical personnel evacuating from field hospitals before Soviet forces overran them. And 47 SS members whose presence and purpose remained deliberately obscure even to the train's commanding officer. Among the regular soldiers was Gefreiter Klaus Hoffmann, a 23-year-old infantryman from Dresden who'd been writing letters to his younger sister throughout the war. His final letter, mailed from Krakow on January 26th and arriving in Dresden weeks after the city's firebombing, contained observations that his sister would treasure for the rest of her life. "Anna, if I don't survive this retreat, know that I tried to be a good soldier despite serving a cause I came to despise. The train we're boarding tonight carries more than soldiers. The freight cars are guarded like they contain the crown jewels, but I've heard whispers from the SS men. They speak of insurance policies, of materials that could change the war's outcome if properly utilized. I don't know what that means, but the fear in their voices when they discuss the cargo tells me we're transporting something that terrifies them. Perhaps it's better, I don't know. Perhaps ignorance is the last mercy available to soldiers in a dying Reich. The tunnel near Wałbrzych was part of a railway network connecting southwestern Poland to Germany, constructed in the 19th century and expanded during both World Wars. The specific passage that Sonderzug 517 entered was approximately 2.3 kilometers long, cutting through a ridge that the railway had to cross to continue westward. Geological surveys from the 1930s described the tunnel as structurally sound, carved through solid granite with minimal risk of collapse. But that tunnel had a feature that most didn't know about. Midway through its length was a junction, an abandoned spur that connected to a larger underground network built by the Germans during their occupation of Poland. These tunnels, part of the vast Project Ries complex of subterranean facilities that the Nazis had constructed in the Owl Mountains, extended throughout the region, creating a labyrinth of passages meant to house factories, storage facilities, and possibly bunkers for high-level officials. When Soviet artillery began targeting the railway on the morning of January 27, 1945, the bombardment was intense but brief, designed to cut German retreat routes and trap forces that could then be encircled and destroyed. The shells struck areas around the tunnel, collapsing both entrances but, according to Soviet reports, not damaging the tunnel itself. Search parties from the Red Army investigated the collapsed entrances within days but found them impassable, requiring excavation equipment they didn't have available during active combat operations. The official Soviet report filed in February 1945 listed the tunnel as blocked, the train presumably buried under tons of rubble, its passengers and cargo lost. The soldiers aboard Sonderzug 517 were added to the millions of missing personnel from the Eastern Front's final months, their fate considered sealed by artillery bombardment and collapse. The case was closed. The war moved on. And for 78 years, no one questioned what had actually happened in that tunnel. After the war, Poland's communist government conducted limited surveys of damaged infrastructure, prioritizing reconstruction of essential services over investigating collapsed railway tunnels that served no strategic purpose. The tunnel near Wałbrzych remained sealed, its entrances eventually overgrown with vegetation as nature reclaimed what war had disrupted. By the 1960s, locals had largely forgotten that a tunnel existed there at all, much less that it might contain a German military train and hundreds of soldiers who'd vanished in the war's final months. But rumors persisted. Throughout the communist era and into Poland's democratic transition, treasure hunters and amateur historians investigated the area, driven by legends of Nazi gold trains that supposedly disappeared in the region during the Reich's collapse. Most of these searches focused on other locations, particularly areas near Książ Castle where Project Ries tunnels were known to exist. The sealed tunnel near Wałbrzych, with no dramatic stories of treasure attached to it, received little attention. That changed in 2022 when the Polish government announced plans to modernize the railway network in southwestern Poland, upgrading tracks and tunnels to accommodate high-speed trains and increased freight traffic. As part of the preliminary surveys, engineering teams conducted ground-penetrating radar scans of all tunnels along the proposed modernization route. The sealed tunnel near Wałbrzych was included in these surveys, with engineers expecting to find collapsed rock that would need removal before the tunnel could be reopened. What the radar revealed on March 15, 2023, stopped the engineering team cold. The tunnel wasn't collapsed. Both entrances had been deliberately sealed with concrete and steel, creating barriers that were engineered rather than natural. And inside the sealed passage, the radar detected a locomotive and 12 freight cars, positioned on the tracks exactly as they would be during normal transit. Most impossibly, the radar showed no signs of deterioration or collapse inside the tunnel. The train appeared intact, preserved as if it had been placed in a sealed environment designed to prevent decay. Dr. Magdalena Kowalski, the archaeologist assigned to investigate before excavation could proceed, examined the radar data with growing unease. The seals at both tunnel entrances weren't crude blockages created by artillery bombardment. They were sophisticated barriers, constructed with precision that suggested professional engineering. Someone had deliberately sealed Sonderzug 517 inside the tunnel, someone who'd had the time, resources, and motivation to ensure that train and its cargo remained isolated from the outside world. But who? And why? The Polish government's decision to excavate was made after intense debate. Opening the tunnel meant recovering remains of 347 soldiers who deserved proper burial, but it also meant potentially uncovering whatever sensitive materials Hauptmann Steiner had described in his journal. Materials that the SS had guarded with extreme caution, materials that might still pose hazards after 78 years of sealed isolation. The excavation began on August 1, 2023, with specialized teams wearing full protective equipment. Military historians, forensic specialists, hazmat experts, and representatives from German, Polish, and Russian governments observed as cutting torches finally penetrated the western entrance seal. When the barrier was breached, releasing air that had been sealed since 1945, the team paused. Because that air smelled wrong. Not stale or musty like sealed spaces should smell. Chemical. Sharp. As if whatever was inside the tunnel had been producing compounds that shouldn't exist in an abandoned railway passage. The first team entered the tunnel with extreme caution, their flashlights cutting through darkness that had persisted for 78 years. And what they found, positioned on the tracks approximately 300 meters from the western entrance, would challenge every assumption about what had happened to Sonderzug 517 on January 27, 1945. Because the train wasn't just preserved, it was pristine, as if someone had been maintaining it, caring for it, keeping it ready for a journey that never resumed. The locomotive stood on the tracks with its boiler cold but intact. The passenger cars showed no signs of deterioration, their windows unbroken, their doors closed. And the 12 sealed freight cars that Hauptmann Steiner had described sat exactly as they'd been loaded in Krakow, guarded still by silence and darkness and secrets that 78 years of burial hadn't diminished. The investigation team stood before that impossible train and understood that Sonderzug 517's disappearance hadn't been an accident of war. It had been deliberate, planned, executed with precision by someone who'd known exactly what the train carried and exactly why it needed to remain hidden forever. The real investigation was about to begin, and what it would reveal about the cargo in those sealed freight cars would prove that some secrets from the Second World War were deliberately buried not because they were shameful, but because they were dangerous. Dangerous enough that someone, whether German, Soviet, or perhaps both, had decided that Sonderzug 517 and its 347 passengers needed to disappear permanently, and that the price of that security was leaving hundreds of soldiers buried alive in a sealed tunnel, trusting that no one would ever ask the right questions or possess the technology to discover what had been hidden beneath Polish soil for nearly 8 decades. The first teams to enter the tunnel advanced slowly past the pristine locomotive, their suit lights reflecting from polished steel and glass that should have dulled over the decades. The passenger cars were eerily untouched, boots lined up at sleeping berths, worn uniforms hanging from hooks, letters and books abandoned mid-read as if the soldiers had expected to return at any moment. Every compartment hinted at sudden disappearance instead of violent death. No blood, no bullet holes, no signs of mass panic. Just quiet, suspended in time. As the team advanced toward the 12 sealed freight cars guarded by warning labels in faded German, every step into the shadowed depths amplified the sense of unreality. The padlocks on the first 2 boxcars had been cut by hand, but the doors wouldn't budge, their edges fused into the steel as if they'd melted and hardened in a single motion. Thermal imaging equipment registered readings far below ambient temperature, indicating the interiors were colder than the rest of the tunnel, creating a wall of frost around the seal. This wasn't natural preservation, it was intentional containment. After 3 days of preparation, with government observers watching live footage from the tunnel, specialists equipped with portable plasma torches finally breached the doors of car number 7, the one recorded in Hauptmann Steiner's manifest as holding material designation Theta. The space inside the car glowed with a blue-white light, illuminating a cargo of metal crates stacked nearly to the ceiling. Each crate bore the same triangle-in-circle insignia as Project Kronos. The first crate, methodically opened by a bomb disposal specialist, contained a glass canister filled with a swirling, luminescent liquid. The readings defied every known chemical or radiological profile. Hazmat checks showed no immediate danger, but as the canister was removed from the crate, every electronic device in a 15-meter radius went dead. In other crates, the teams found notebooks filled with mathematical equations written in a hybrid of German, Russian, and an unknown symbolic script. There were strange metal spheres, each marked with serial numbers that didn't match any registered German equipment. Inside, when scanned, were tiny gear mechanisms, not unlike clockwork, but with pieces thinner than a human hair, impossible to manufacture even with today's technology. In one crate was a bone-white tablet inscribed with a script so regular it could only have been the output of a machine, but the material, somewhere between stone and porcelain, reflected light with the same blue-white shimmer as the canister. Farther down, the sealed cars gave up cargo that crossed the line from advanced to inexplicable. Car number 11, marked in the log for living cargo special containment, contained a glass coffin. Inside was the body of a man in a Wehrmacht dress uniform, perfectly preserved, his flesh pink and almost warm to the touch. Records sewn into his pocket identified him as Oberleutnant Karl Weiss, missing since March 1944 from a site more than 500 kilometers away. Scans indicated neural activity, barely perceptible electrical patterns shimmering in shock waves across the body's cortex as if resisting the passage of time itself. But nothing prepared the investigators for car number 12, farthest from the tunnel entrance and closest to the ancient service spur rumored to connect with Project Reese's uncharted complex. The car contained 2 objects. The first was a cylindrical device, 2 meters long, covered in engraved spirals and geometric lines. Teams later discovered that the spirals continued inside the device, arranged as a miniature labyrinth lined with crystalline prisms and metallic coils of unknown function. A data team established that the device emitted a continuous radio signal at a frequency outside the known electromagnetic spectrum, modulated in short bursts as though broadcasting a language or code. The second object was what stunned the entire team into silence, a set of human skeletons arranged in perfect geometric formation around a crystal pedestal which held a ledger open to a page with names written in German, Russian, and Polish. Each name corresponded to a vanished Wehrmacht or Red Army officer assigned to the Eastern Front and listed as missing between 1943 and 1945. Genetic tests would later confirm some of the skeletons as those of officers never found or accounted for by their home countries, seemingly collected and placed together for a ritual or purpose that no one could yet decipher. Engineers searching the service spur at the end of the tunnel found it far more than an abandoned shaft. It led, after 400 meters, to a concrete vault walled by yet another layer of steel. Here, the team discovered a control room filled with Nazi and Soviet-era paperwork, schematics, and a command console wired into the tunnel's main power feeds. Analysis of the schematics revealed the purpose. The console controlled a system of remotely triggered demolition charges, rigged to the tunnel walls to ensure once Sonderzug 517 entered, both ends could be sealed in under 5 minutes. Security orders in German, signed by an SS Oberfuhrer and bearing a Soviet NKVD counter-signature, made it clear the tunnel and its contents were to vanish without trace should evacuation become impossible. But as investigation continued, a more chilling truth emerged from the notebooks and logs recovered from the car marked Theta. The cargo was not merely technological, it was the product of a clandestine Nazi-Soviet wartime collaboration designed to test dimensional isolation as part of Project Kronos. The intent was to use the crystalline device found in car number 12 to create a localized rupturing of space-time, essentially suspending whatever was inside the tunnel in a pocket of altered time. Never aging, never progressing, perpetually isolated from the outside world. The logs described at least 3 test firings in late 1944, each with catastrophic results. Passage of time inside experimental zones was slowed almost to a halt while external time continued, rendering subjects inside unchanged for decades. The ultimate fate of the volunteers was classified, but the implication was clear. Sonderzug 517 was intended as the final full-scale live trial, using an entire train's worth of soldiers, staff, and materials as both test subjects and a means of burying the program's failures in secrecy. Forensics confirmed it. The bodies in the passenger cars bore none of the expected markers of 78 years spent underground. Tissues, where they remained, were mummified yet not decayed. Watches, calendars, and even dried rations in soldiers' kits showed no passage of time after January 27, 1945. Some pens still sat uncapped, ink liquid, and readable, as if waiting for their owners to continue writing when the tunnel was finally unsealed. As the scope of the secret became clear, Polish authorities issued a media blackout. Scientists were forbidden from publishing data or even discussing their findings beyond superiors with high-level clearance. What was shared with the families of the lost was sanitized. The train had been found, remains recovered and identified as possible, and burial with honors or repatriation was being arranged. But in the quiet corridors of government, military, and intelligence agencies on 3 continents, the horror and magnitude of what was inside that tunnel continued to reverberate. 347 soldiers and civilians, caught in the last, most desperate technological gamble of the war, had become living proof of ambitions that reached far beyond human morality or imagination. Their preservation was not a miracle, but a warning, about the borders of knowledge that should never be crossed, and the price of experimental hubris when the record of history is written in blood and shadow. Today, the tunnel near Wałbrzych has been resealed. What remains of Sonderzug 517, its secrets, and its message about the darkness lurking in the hidden corners of conflict, lie protected for future generations to decide whether the price of uncovering is ever truly justified. Occasionally, those who stand over the grassy mounds above the lost tunnel say the air feels colder, the world a little thinner, and if you listen close, you still might hear the whistle of a train somewhere deep below, heading nowhere, carrying secrets best left undisturbed.